Hi, I'm Alex Konrad, a senior editor of Forbes and editor of our Midas List. I'm joined today by Iain Martin, a Europe news editor and the editor of our second annual Midas Seed List. Iain, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Alex. Good to join you.
Awesome. So, second Midas Seed List and a very different venture capital environment than years past. What was your first impression looking through these 25 investors appearing on our Midas Seed?
Well, Alex, this list is really driven by exits and large valuations. And whereas last year there was a deal frenzy in terms of listings, IPOs, and also a lot of very large rounds going through, some of that has cooled off now.
Yeah,
So the
where
list
where
is
are the
really,
exits?
there have been some changes at the top of the list. We've seen Anna Fang from the Gen Farm has fallen down slightly. This is reflecting a change in valuations of Chinese startups. Obviously, we've seen a lot of coverage around companies like ByteDance, Shein, and sort of the tension about sort of one, their growth in the US and internationally, but also concerns about that as well, and also sort of the impact of those regulatory concerns on their valuations. At the same time, we've seen that Pejman Nazad of Pear Ventures has risen to the top of the list. He's obviously a Silicon Valley veteran. He'd be familiar to anyone who's followed venture capital and seed investing over the years. And again, this kind of confirms his legacy there based on that and really successful investments and exits from companies like DoorDash and AppLovin and Gusta.
And Pejman has a great story that we've written about in Forbes. I think we actually wrote a magazine story about him over a decade ago, one of the first. But he was a rug dealer. Then he became an investor on behalf of the owner of the rug shop. Then eventually, he was finding these deals for big firms like Sequoia, and then obviously now leads Pear VC. It is interesting that he moves up this year. It's almost like the folks who had exits in the last couple of years that weren't the freshest, but happened fairly recently. They moved up as other people moved back in. Wouldn't you agree? Kind of the revenge of this IPO, perhaps.
Very much so. Like obviously Pejman has got some very big exits there. DoorDash, sort of now it's a public company. The valuation has fallen down quite a bit, but he's already exited there. But there have been stocks that have been impacted more. Like when we're going further down the list, we're kind of looking at companies that are still private, something like Revolut, where, as with many fintechs, it was trading on the private markets at a very high valuation. But given sort of how public market investors are now treating something like Nubank or Chime, sort of we are also having to reassess how those deals are valued as a sort of knock-on effect.
Ian, you're obviously based in London. Did we see any European investors make this list? How international is it?
Well, that's a good question. As we've also seen some shuffling in terms of the location of investors. One of the recurring investors is Rashma Sohoni from Seacamp, though she was a London-based investor and now relocated to Florida. There is also sort of quite a sort of Miami migration as well, which Rashma's part of in the list. The other really big notable name on the list is Pavel Trzynski of Point Nine. He's a Berlin-based investor who is really universally respected for his fintech investments. So he's very early into Revolut, which we've already discussed, and has been impacted. But it was obviously he got in very early. And companies like Chain Analysis, the crypto analytics company, we also got some other examples like kind of Mambu, and also he has some consumer bets, like something like Tier Mobility, the scooter company.
Got it. Got it. Now, Ian, you spoke to one of the newcomers on the list for an article that we published as part of the launch package. Could you tell us a little bit about Chris Howard, the subject of your article?
Sure. Chris is somebody that sort of came up several times in the discussions, and he's also been featured before on the Midas Sprinkler list several years ago, but he's kind of broken through into the rankings of the seed list.
And for
Um,
viewers who don't know about the Midas Brink list, that's kind of an up and comers list of people that Forbes believes are likely to make the Midas list in the future. And so I guess Chris is an example of that actually happening.
Very much so. He's an interesting investor. I think it's fair to say he's very well connected in the Bay Area now. He's originally from Seattle. He has a background as a consumer marketer. He sort of worked on sort of ad campaigns for companies like Lexus and New Balance. Though weirdly, or kind of maybe counterintuitively, some of his best deals have actually been very sort of B2B or industrial focused. So he was a very early investor into Flexboards, something like Convoy as well, and also Lattice. That's Jack Eltman's HR tech startup.
So have any of those companies been appreciating in value or seeing positive momentum that would be reflecting in Chris's portfolio? Or why do you think he, debuted on the list this year?
That's a very good question. I think all those companies I've just mentioned have had a pretty good run in terms of Flexboards, Convoy, and also Lattice in terms of growing their valuations. I also think another big driver there is that he was an early investor into Figma, the collaborative design startup. Now, Adobe's put a $20 billion price tag on Figma when it offered to buy it last year. Whether that deal can get through, given the antitrust environments in the US, in the UK, and Europe, is a good question. But it's a suggestion of just how valuable Figma has become as a business.
Was there anything about Chris that surprised you, or that he was saying about seed investing right now? What's the vibe as an early stage investor from your interview?
Yes, there's some really big changes for Chris this year. He started running Fuel Capital as a solo GP. At the time, that was a relatively new thing. Along the way, he's picked up Leah Sullivan, the founder of TaskRabbit, the handyman marketplace. So Chris will be going back into working as a solo GP in an environment where seed is becoming a lot more competitive. He started his career working at enterprise-focused funds, and he observed a shift 10 years ago that investors were going earlier and earlier. So decided that he would start a seed program, and then he would start his own seed funds. Now, obviously, we have angel investors writing ever bigger checks, and we also have some of the multi-stage funds moving down lower, away from Series A into seed, so increasing competition. And as a solo GP, there's only so many companies you can work with versus a multi-stage fund where potentially they have a small army of associates who can do research and chase down deals.
Got it. Do you think, from Chris's perspective or from your understanding of these investors, do you think it's a harder time to be a seed investor right now in sort of a more bear market?
That's a good question. I think Chris is quite a positive guy, and I think he sees this as kind of slightly as business as usual. But then in some respects, he's quite sort of classic seed investor. He's maybe only doing sort of 10, 12 deals a year, and he's very focused on having like a very high-touched, involved relationship with the founders. And, there's probably challenges later on in terms of, can these companies continue to raise? Like, will it be harder for these companies? For example, if it is something like Lattice, where we need to sell subscriptions and memberships to other corporates in an environment where a lot of companies are looking to sort of tighten belts and tighten budgets, are there headwinds there? But I think Chris's focus, as he told me, it was kind of business as usual, just looking for great founders who have that edge, who have that insight, and helping them kind of build that business and sort of scratch their own itch of the kind of industry they know and the product they know can help solve those problems.
Is there anything else looking at the seed list that you think is an important lesson from this year? If we have entrepreneurs or people who want to be backed by these investors, someday, seeing this list, is there anything that you think is an important lesson or kind of trend that you saw from Midas Seed this year?
If you don't mind, Alex, I'll turn the tables on you. Like, what are the trends you were seeing in the Midas Seed list this year?
One thing that I found interesting, Iain, is we saw a couple folks graduate off last year's list because they're no longer seed firms. And I think it's a classic, interesting point of tension that a lot of these firms do want to kind of expand or evolve their focus and perhaps write bigger checks across stages. And this list is really focused just on those seed investors. So one thing that I find really interesting is to see people like Pejman, or it sounds like Chris, who have been kind of following this playbook for a long time. They're not trying to scale up really fast and use this as a springboard to kind of try to be the next multi-billion-dollar firm. And so I think, to me, that's kind of interesting. And I also find it interesting, what you said about Chris only doing 10 or 12 deals a year, because, with hundreds of companies coming out of Y Combinator, it could be very easy to try to just sort of play the board and do a ton of deals to hope they become the next DoorDash or, company like that. So it seems like a lot of these investors don't take that approach.
It's interesting you bring up Y Combinator. As sort of looking at Chris's most successful investments, they all came through Y Combinator, and kind of he credits sort of spending a lot of time in the early days of Y Combinator and sort of building connections with the Altmans and also Paul Graham in terms of having given him access to the network and to sort of be able to pick out some of the best companies that are coming through. So yeah, I mean, does that cohort grow ever larger? Yes. Is having sort of trusted insights also kind of references who can point you to the best companies, the best founders? I think that lets people still kind of cut through the noise there. Yeah.
So Iain, having led our Midas efforts for a number of years, one thing that we've always tracked and that has been a little frustrating for me personally is the diversity of the Midas list and its various other lists and lack thereof, the need for improvement in diversity on these Midas lists. What does the Midas Seed List look like this year from that perspective? And what's your takeaway?
There's a challenge here in terms of how the list is structured. It's a data-driven list that is backward-looking, based around sort of deal valuations. Hopefully, over time, we would start to see more female founders rising in the list, and we have seen some signs of that. There is also a challenge in terms of the industry. There's been much reported and covered by Forbes extensively in terms of there is a lack of diversity and representation at the top of venture funds. That's something that is changing, and certainly when you are out about in London, New York, or Silicon Valley, starting to see a more equal and more diverse range of investors. But I think this will take time to address.
Got it. Well, something for us to keep watching and keep shining a light on. Iain, thank you so much for your work with Midas Seed and for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you, Alex.